Little girl saved the giant Wolfdog, but the DNA results revealed something shocking. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. A fateful encounter in the frozen Yukon, one child, one chain, and a miracle. In the dim light of early morning in the Yukon, where snow blanketed every path and breath turned to mist before it fully formed, 6-year-old Ava Sinclair followed her grandmother along a forest trail leading to the edge of the Coldridge Wildlife Reserve in northern Canada. Ava had been a quiet child ever since the sudden death of her father in a train accident. From that moment on, her world was a silent one, full of snow and shadow, where only her eyes spoke for her. But that morning, something extraordinary happened. From a distance came a low, aching sound, almost a whimper, carried on the cold wind. Ava's grandmother tried to steer her away, but Ava stopped in her tracks, her eyes locked in the direction of the sound. Without a word, she slipped free from her grandmother's hand and ran, as if pulled by some invisible thread. Beyond a line of frost-bitten pine trees lay a heartbreaking sight. A massive black mother bear, her fur dusted with snow, was chained by a rusted steel shackle to an old, disused railway track. Every time she tried to move, the chain scraped against metal, ringing out like a cry of desperation in the frozen silence. Nearby, 3 armed local rangers stood arguing. "That bear's been spotted near livestock camps. She's dangerous," one said. "We don't have time if the patrol train comes through," another muttered. Ava didn't hear them. She only saw the bear. The mother bear, eyes full of terror and pain, met Ava's gaze. And in that instant, something incredible happened. Before anyone could react, Ava walked past the adults, through the deep snow, straight toward the bear. The rangers shouted, their rifles lifting out of pure instinct. But the bear didn't move. It didn't growl. It didn't flinch. Instead, it exhaled a long, weary breath and bowed its head as Ava approached. The girl knelt down, her tiny hand resting on the rusted iron of the chain. A small action, but one that left everyone frozen. Ava, who hadn't spoken a word in 4 years, whispered, softly, but clearly enough to echo through the cold woods, "Don't be afraid. I'm here." No one could speak. The eldest ranger lowered his rifle and nodded slowly. Another dropped his flashlight into the snow. Moments later, they all worked together to remove the chain, the broken wall, and the first word. The quiet recovery room of the Coldridge Rescue Center glowed with the soft amber of a northern afternoon. Outside, snow fell steadily, flurries drifting like memories across a frozen sky. But inside the special care wing, time itself seemed to hold its breath. 6-year-old Ava Sinclair sat cross-legged on the floor, her back resting gently against the mesh of a reinforced enclosure. On the other side lay Kale, a massive black bear still recovering from his injuries. She placed one small hand against the cold metal, and from inside, a huge paw responded, pressing to meet hers through the steel. 2 beings from 2 worlds, reaching for something ancient and unseen. Then, in a voice as soft as wind through pine needles, Ava whispered her very first word. Safe. It was the first time she had spoken. Ever. Dr. Miriam Rowan, animal behaviorist and director of the Coldridge Center, stood frozen in place. She could hardly believe her ears. In nearly a year of overseeing therapy and wildlife interaction for trauma recovery, she had seen nothing like this. Ava had never responded to any program. Not to music, not to therapy, not to people, until now. "My God," Miriam breathed. She just spoke. Next to her stood Owen Vick, veteran ranger and one of the men who had once raised his rifle at Kale in the Yukon woods. He looked shaken, his eyes fixed on the girl and the bear. "She called him safe," he muttered. "A half-ton wild bear, and she calls him safe." From that day forward, Ava began to change, slowly but deeply. She still didn't speak much. She didn't respond to therapists or answer questions. But with Kale, she laughed. She drew. She whispered words. "Stay," she whispered words. "Stay." "Listen. Don't fear." And Kale, once aggressive and reclusive, began eating again. He paced less, he slept more. And every time Ava entered the room, he moved toward her with a calm reverence, like a soldier reporting to his only commander. News spread fast across Coldridge. Girl speaks for the first time to a bear. Not just speech, someone whispered. It's communication. Journalists came. Scientists called. Even a team from the Ministry of Wildlife and Biobehavioral Safety arrived to assess the situation. In a tense meeting, Miriam stood firm. "This isn't just therapy," she said. "It's a phenomenon. A bond I've never seen. And if you remove either of them, you may sever something deeper than we understand." But not everyone agreed. Elroy Mathers, regional ranger chief, was one of them. The same man who once ordered Cale to be shot. "Ava Sinclair is special," Elroy said coldly. "But emotions don't manage wildlife. A bear is still a bear. One wrong move and no one will be fast enough to save that child." Then came the night of the storm. A power surge triggered a system failure in the special care wing. Cale's enclosure, secured by an electronic lock, opened. The center went into lockdown. Miriam, Owen Elroy, and a team rushed to the scene. On the monitors, Cale was out, but he wasn't running. He was lying quietly, just outside Ava's door. The little girl, still in her pajamas, sat upright in bed, calm as ever. Cale didn't growl, didn't move, just lay still, guarding the door. Elroy raised his rifle. "Back away!" he shouted. Then Ava did the impossible. She rose from bed, walked calmly to the door, opened it, stood between the gun and the bear. "Stop," she said. "Not him, never him, never him." And Cale, obedient, patient, lowered his head, as if he understood every word. Elroy, trembling, lowered his gun. What happened next prompted a national inquiry. A team of neuroscientists, animal behavior experts, and linguistic researchers was flown in. In a secure study room, Ava was observed. EEG wires tracked her brain waves. Cameras recorded her every blink. Cale was placed behind a one-way mirror. When Ava looked toward him, her neural scans spiked, synced with emotional resonance patterns never before seen in a human-animal study. "She's not just communicating," Dr. Godfrey, a leading neurolinguist, said. "She's aligning," as if their systems were connected. In her journal that night, Miriam wrote, "Cale is a bear, but he is more. And Ava is not healing, she is becoming." This isn't rehabilitation. It's a restoration of something ancient, between child and wild, between what was broken and what never truly left. Later that evening, Ava curled in her bed, sketching another image. Cale, under the stars, no fences, no cages, just a girl and a bear, connected by a thread of light. And the story was only just beginning. Beneath the ice, truth awakens. The snow fell heavier than usual in late March over Coldridge. Across the icy slopes surrounding the rescue center, everything seemed hushed. Only the wind howled, and the cautious footsteps of those who no longer believed in coincidence remained. Dr. Maeve Lorenzen, the lead researcher at the center, sat quietly at her desk, eyes locked on the computer screen. The genetic results from Cale had just come back from the University of British Columbia. She had read them 3 times, but the final sentence still sent chills down her spine. The unidentified synthetic gene matches the structure of biological subjects in Project Borealis. File ID, MIA 274. Expunged from system in 2003. Project Borealis. That name had disappeared from all official scientific records nearly 2 decades ago. Maeve had only heard rumors, experiments in the Yukon to create hybrid creatures adapted to climate extremes. No one believed they succeeded, not until Cale appeared. Elsewhere on the snowy grounds, 6-year-old Ava sat outside, her back against a frozen log, eyes following Cale as he paced within his enclosure. No words, no calling. Cale always knew where she was. When he paused, his silvery eyes would find hers, communicating in complete silence, as if their minds had once touched beyond the limits of this world. Ava set her sketchbook on her lap. She had drawn Cale nearly every day since they met. But today, something was different. Cale wasn't alone in the drawing. There were other beings, larger glowing eyes. And in the background, a steel bunker door with a broken snowflake insignia. She didn't know why she was able to draw it. Rachel Sinclair, Ava's mother, approached. "Sweetheart, it's cold. Let's go inside," she said gently. Ava didn't reply. She simply pointed at the drawing. Rachel looked, frowning. "Who told you about this place?" Ava whispered. "Kale, in my head." That night, Maeve unlocked a sealed internal archive at the center. She used an old access code from her predecessor, Dr. Piers Hallstrom, who had vanished 4 years ago. A series of files appeared. Most were surveillance videos from 2009, when the center first opened. One clip froze her blood, footage of a creature strikingly similar to Kale, larger, darker fur, being dragged into the center, severely wounded. A man walked beside it, wearing a military insignia. The video cut off when the creature suddenly looked up at the camera, its eyes glowing under infrared. Maeve knew what she had to do. At sunrise she drove to Rachel's home. "You need to see this," she said. In the warmth of the kitchen, Maeve played the video. Ava, watching silently, trembled. Then she reached out and placed her small hand on the screen. "That's Kale's mother," she said softly. Rachel froze. In the days that followed, Ava began having strange dreams. She spoke, more than just one sentence at a time. For the first time, she said Kale wasn't just an animal. He was a piece of something torn apart, a remnant. "My mom is trapped," Ava whispered one sleepless night. "They keep her underground. There's pain. But Kale hears her in the wind." Maeve began cross-referencing Ava's drawings, symbols, tunnels, locations she had never visited. The most disturbing detail: Ava's map matched the location of an abandoned military base near the Alaskan border, a place once sealed off called Silo 9. Rachel, Maeve, and a small team of trusted volunteers made a decision. They would go there, across frozen terrain, in the heart of winter. They would bring Kale with them. As they neared the coordinates of the forgotten base, their electromagnetic scanners began to spike wildly. Kale grew tense but not afraid. He was leading them. And Eva? She walked calmly beside him, as if she was returning to a place she belonged before she was ever born. Then it appeared, a massive metal hatch buried in the snow, rusted but humming faintly with power. A retinal scanner sat dormant beside it. Maeve stepped back, unsure. Ava stepped forward. "No, sweetie, wait," Rachel called out, but it was too late. Ava leaned into the scanner. A soft green light blinked. Access granted. The hatch hissed open, groaning as the ancient mechanism awakened. No one spoke. Kale, Ava said calmly. "She's waiting." Under the pale gray sky and biting winds of the Yukon, the Northridge Biological Research Station sat in a silence no one welcomed. Rows of steel enclosures lay quiet like a graveyard for once wild, once free creatures. In the farthest corner, out of sight from visitors, Kale lay confined. Once a towering presence of the northern wilderness, he was now a shadow of himself. Sunken eyes shedding fur, shallow breaths. He wasn't dying from sickness, but from absence. Dr. Lionel Hartman, the station's director, stood in front of the reinforced enclosure, clipboard in hand, though his eyes never left the unmoving figure inside. "He won't make it through the winter at this rate," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone. Beside him stood Yara Morgan, a young assistant recently transferred from Toronto. She glanced through the bulletproof glass. "You called him, hey," she said softly. "Did you realize that?" Hartman didn't answer right away. He closed his eyes for a beat. "There are some creatures, once you've looked into their eyes, you can't call them it ever again." Back in Coldridge, Ava Sinclair wasn't herself either. She no longer looked anyone in the eye, no longer scribbled on paper like she used to. Every therapy session ended in silence. Her blank stare, her untouched crayons, everything screamed loss. Rachel, her mother, had tried everything. Specialists, art books, even sensory immersion therapy. But Ava just sat there, not eating, not speaking, not sleeping fully. One evening, Rachel found her daughter drawing in the dark. Under the dim light of the bedside lamp was a charcoal sketch. A large black creature curled in snow, eyes open but lifeless. Below it, scrawled in trembling handwriting, the first Ava had ever written, were the words, "Hey is forgetting me." Rachel broke down. And then she made a decision. A week later, under the guise of special therapy liaison, Rachel applied as a part-time volunteer at the Northridge facility. She was rejected, until an old veterinarian friend who had once worked with Hartman intervened. Ava went with her, disguised in a medical mask and winter cap. No one noticed the little girl among the support staff, except for one pair of eyes. Cale, barely aware, lifted his head. For the first time in weeks, his gaze moved. The first reunion didn't require permission. Cale, previously unresponsive to anyone, stood up when Ava entered the observation hall. Rachel and Hartman only caught a blur, going from stillness to alertness, like a warrior woken from long slumber. Ava didn't flinch. She pressed her hand to the glass. "Cale," she whispered. No one had reminded her of his name, but she remembered. Cale stepped forward, slow and silent. No growl, no fear. He placed his forehead on the exact spot where her palm rested. Between them, 4 inches of glass could not stop the miracle. Hartman whispered, barely audible, That can't be a conditioned response." The next day, Cale ate, then drank, then walked. And every time Ava came, he was already waiting by the door. Rachel begged for a supervised direct session. Hartman refused. Reckless, unsafe, unscientific. But it was Yara who changed his mind after secretly watching security footage of the silent interaction. "If she's the only reason he's alive," she said, "then ethically we owe them both a chance." The first contact inside the enclosure was held under strict protocols. Ava walked in with nothing but her old faded purple beanie. Cale entered from the far side, cautious, reverent. No growling, no panic. He approached like returning to a forest he once ruled. Ava held out her hand, this time no glass. Cale placed his snout in her palm. She smiled, for the first time in 2 months. That night, Hartman wrote in his private research log, "I used to believe science left no room for emotion. But today, a child and a creature of unknown origin reminded me there are things beyond molecules and DNA." What saved Cale may not have been medicine. It was memory, connection, something we still don't understand. But up north, ice was breaking. Somewhere in the shadows, an old project stirred. A message arrived anonymously at Northridge's inbox. "If Cale has reconnected, the rest will follow." What had seemed like the end was only the beginning. The marked one, and the memory of ancient ice. The Yukon sky that day hung low and heavy, as if winter refused to loosen its grip. Snow drifted gently down over the roof of the small biology research station. Inside a modest wooden cabin, Naomi Sinclair sat across from Tulak, a seasoned researcher with silver eyes as deep as glacial rivers. Between them lay one of Ava's drawings, a small hand marked with a swirling symbol, a snow-like spiral traced in childlike strokes. The same symbol, faint and mysterious, appeared and faded on Ava's wrist depending on when she touched Cale. "She doesn't just carry the snow mark," Tulak said in his gravelly voice, slow and deliberate. "She awakened it. The last time we saw this was over 80 years ago. A child disappeared in a blizzard and was found days later, sleeping unharmed inside a polar bear's den." Naomi didn't know how to respond. Science had never prepared her for this, but deep down the instinct of a mother told her Tulak wasn't wrong. Ava, once silent to the world, had needed only a look from Cale to begin truly living. "So, what does this mean?" Naomi asked, pressing her own wrist as if to ground herself. Tulak closed his eyes as though listening to something far beyond the room. "It means no government, no lab, no law has the right to separate them. The spirits of the forest don't choose wrong." Back at the research station, Cale was no longer just a creature in captivity. Every day he lay motionless, more statue than beast. The team had hoped he would adapt to his controlled environment, but those amber eyes, once wild and curious, had dulled to gray. Until that night, a sudden howl ripped through the facility, not fierce, but filled with anguish. Cale thrashed, claws tearing into the steel floor. Monitors flashed warnings. Lights flickered. And yet, as the staff rushed in, he wasn't violent. He stood frozen, eyes fixed on a single window that faced the wild north. "It's like he heard something," a tech whispered. Something old. That same moment in Coldridge, Ava sat by her window. Snow blanketed the backyard, but her gaze was unwavering, aimed northward. Suddenly, she turned, ran to her mother. "Mom, Cale! Cale is calling me." It was the first full sentence of her life. Naomi nearly dropped the mug in her hand. "You can hear him?" Ava nodded, placing her palm over her chest. "In here, like thunder, but it doesn't hurt." 3 days later, Naomi brought Ava to Wildvale, a remote forest village where Tulak had once lived. There, he introduced them to Akira, a quiet Inuk woman known as the Flamekeeper, guardian of sacred tradition. "To break the chains between soul and form," Akira said, lighting an oil lamp carved with spirals, "we must call the first memory." Her voice dropped. "It's dangerous, but necessary. Ava isn't just a chosen child. She's a reflection, where wild spirit finds its voice." Naomi's hands trembled. "What if we fail?" Akira's eyes were solemn. "Then Cale will die, and a piece of Ava will die with him." That night, under a full moon, a ritual circle was carved into the snow. Ava sat in the center, clutching a necklace braided from Cale's shed fur. Around her, villagers and guardians kept silent vigil. Akira burned snow powder, cedar, spruce resin, and wolf ash. Smoke spiraled skyward. Ava closed her eyes, and then she spoke, not aloud, but from within. "Cale, one word, low and primal." Back at the research station, Cale jolted up. Sensors screamed alerts, but he didn't attack. He lifted his head and howled, not in rage, but in recognition. Then, the lock disengaged. No one could explain it. He walked out, untouched, vanished into the northern woods. At dawn in Wildvale, before the sun rose, Ava opened her eyes and stepped outside the ritual tent. A shadow waited in the snow. "Cale," Naomi gasped. Ava didn't run. She raised one hand. "Cale," she called, her voice clear. He bowed his head. No growl, no fear. Only the silence of understanding. They touched. A wild creature and a child. No one needed to declare it. They belonged to each other, not by blood, but by something deeper, older, and no cage could hold. News spread through provinces, broadcasts, universities. Under public pressure and with Tulak's support, the government designated Cale a unique biological entity, allowing him to live with Ava under special protection. And when Ava began drawing again, her first picture showed Cale under a starlit sky, with her beside him, holding one massive paw in her small hand. A child who never spoke, a creature no one could tame, and a world forced to learn how to listen again. Reunion and the gift of spirit communication. Naomi fought tirelessly for Ava to be allowed access to the Yukon Research Station. Not as a patient, not as a subject of pity, but as a volunteer with a purpose. After weeks of petitioning, psychological evaluations, and carefully crafted arguments citing Ava's unique behavior and Cale's declining condition, the station granted limited access under strict supervision. The first time Ava stepped onto the cold floor of the observation corridor, Cale, who had not moved for days, rose. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He walked to the edge of his enclosure and waited. It was Ava who reached out first, forming a small, deliberate gesture with her fingers, a sign she had never been taught but seemed to know instinctively. Cale tilted his head, blinked once, then mirrored the gesture with a paw raised gently to the glass. The room fell into stunned silence. Dr. Evan Rosner, the station's lead behavioral biologist, scribbled frantic notes while whispering to his assistant. "That's not mimicry, that's comprehension." Over the next few days, Ava visited Cale for brief sessions. With every encounter, their communication deepened. Not through spoken words, but through a series of hand symbols, subtle movements, and the occasional hum from Ava's throat that Cale would respond to with a tilt of the ears or a low, steady breath. It wasn't training. It wasn't obedience. It was something else entirely. Dialogue. For the first time, the station staff began logging Cale's emotional states, based not on behavior, but on Ava's interaction reports. She'd draw symbols in a small notebook afterward, sometimes with dots, sometimes spirals, and every time she showed the page to Cale through the glass, He would respond, howling softly if the spiral was shaded dark, or laying flat with his eyes on ons. Her if it was light. The breakthrough caught the attention of a cross-border neurological team in Alaska. Dr. Sophia Lang, a neuroethologist specializing in interspecies perception, reviewed footage and declared, "This isn't empathy. This is transspecies cognitive resonance. Her mind and his, they're sensing." But perhaps most striking of all was how Ava began to change. She laughed, once in the middle of a snow squall, when Cale pressed his nose to the window and fogged up a heart shape. She began to speak, not in long sentences, but in words of clarity, of weight. Words like, safe cold dream, each one followed by a gesture Cale would match. Together they painted meaning where language could not. And so in a cold corner of Yukon wilderness, a girl long thought unreachable and a wolf born of ancient blood forged a bond that defied biology, medicine, and logic. What began as a chance encounter had become a dialogue of the soul, and the world was finally starting to listen. The awakening of the iceborne bond. Soft winter sunlight filtered through the frost-covered glass of the Yukon Bioresearch Station. Silence hung thick in the air, broken only by the subtle beeps of biometric monitors. Yet no scientist present that day, no matter how many decades they'd spent studying wolves, could have predicted what was unfolding in Room 6, the unit designated for specimen K8, Cale. Ava Sinclair sat in the corner, bundled in a pale gray fleece coat. Her small hands moved with rhythmic precision, a silent language of gestures she had created. Across the thick observation glass, Cale, a massive Arctic hybrid with silver fur that shimmered like moonlit snow, watched her every movement with intense focus. He responded without hesitation, tilting his head, backing up, sitting, or releasing a low hum that echoed through the room like a wind sighing over frozen earth. One of the young researchers whispered, "Hey is," reading her mind. Dr. Naomi Sinclair, Ava's mother, stood silently nearby. She didn't respond. Her face, etched with sleepless nights and quiet desperation, reflected something new, belief. Not in data, not in diagnosis, but in what she saw before her eyes, an understanding no words could contain. 2 weeks later, the lab received a deeper analysis of the iceborne gene from the University of Alberta. Dr. Ames, a leading expert in cross-species genetics, adjusted his glasses, furrowed his brow, and stared at the data comparisons. "This structure," he said slowly, "doesn't align with any known genetic map but what's more concerning," he pulled up a waveform display. "When these two, Ava and Cale, occupy the same space, this sequence activates intensely, producing a signal pattern nearly identical to human gamma brainwaves." Naomi whispered, "They're synchronizing. Not just that. They're transmitting information, memories, sensations. This isn't interaction. This is symbiosis." At that same moment, a strange alert triggered the station's security system. An access code, deactivated in 1991, had been pinged from an out-of-network satellite. In the station's classified archive room, a locked file suddenly opened. Project Borealis, Phase 3. Vision of the symbiotic entity. The contents were minimal. Should the iceborne gene reach unification threshold, the subject will exceed standard biological containment. The symbiotic entity is not a tool. It is a doorway. The next morning, the facility was quietly taken over by an unidentified security unit. They wore faded insignias from no known branch of government. No explanations, just orders. Biological threat containment. Ava was placed into isolation. Cale, sedated. Naomi watched it happen with a silent scream stuck in her chest. But Ava didn't panic. Instead, she sat upright. Her hands moved, not the old signs, but a new series of motions. A circle. 3 intersecting points. A jagged arc, like a crack in ice. In the adjacent chamber, Cale stirred. Despite the tranquilizer, his eyes flickered open. His ears twitched. Heart rate spiked from 58 to 84. Brain scans lit up, gamma waves surging in synchrony with Ava's. Then, the system went dark. Lights out, monitors blank, and when power returned, both isolation rooms were empty. Left behind, Ava's final sign, etched in frost on the floor. A circle with 3 points, a place where the boundaries between child and beast, human and wild, had vanished. At the edge of the northern Coldridge woods, beneath a pale sapphire moon, a small silhouette walked beside a towering one. Hand in paw, step by silent step, and far underground, in a long-forgotten facility, dormant servers hummed to life for the first time in 30 years. A symbiotic entity has awakened, and this, no longer just the story of a girl and a wolf, was only the beginning of what was to come. Under the grayish-violet sky of late winter in Yukon, the wind sliced through the forest like a whisper of warning, sweeping across snow-laden pine ridges. Inside the sterile glow of Talvik Research Station's biology lab, Dr. Naomi Sinclair stared at the latest biomedical report, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and dread. The numbers blurred, but the meaning was undeniable. Ava's bone marrow was rapidly failing, and Kale, the mysterious creature who once ruled the forest, was fading in lockstep. Yet what stunned Naomi most wasn't the disease itself, but the genetic symmetry. Ava and Kale, two beings from entirely different species, shared an almost identical sequence in the faulty gene segment. Naomi pressed a hand to her temple, steadying herself. Her daughter, the silent child who had opened up to the world through the eyes of a wolf, was being pulled away by something neither medicine nor logic could explain. And Kale, the wild soul who had become more than just a companion, lay dying as if tethered to her through an unseen thread. In the animal medical ward, Kale lay still, his coat dull, eyes no longer glowing like moonlight. Ava sat just beyond the reinforced glass, silent, unmoving. She didn't eat, didn't sleep, only drew. Her sketches were haunting, Kale curled under snow, encircled by strange symbols. Rings, stars, red threads. They weren't just doodles from a child. They were memories, but not hers. Tulak, the Inuk ethnobiologist, placed a gentle hand on Naomi's shoulder. She's remembering for him. And he's dying for her. Naomi shook her head. That's not possible. You believed in the snowborn gene, he replied. This goes beyond. They don't just share DNA. They share life. A crisis meeting was called. Only 4 people were present. Naomi, Tulak, Professor Emmerich, a leading geneticist from British Columbia, and Station Director Miriam Kessler. I've run the sequence 3 times, Emmerich said, eyes heavy. They share a chain I've never seen before. It's what I'm calling the snow thread sequence, a pattern that only activates when paired. Separately it's dormant, but together it's biologically symphonic. Kale produces stem cells potentially compatible with Ava's immune profile. Naomi's voice trembled, and hers with his? Possibly. The silence that followed was thick with impossible hope and scientific heresy. Kessler spoke slowly. Cross-species stem cell transplants. This is either history or horror. Naomi's hands tightened. I don't care about history. I care about saving my daughter, and Kale. Tulak added quietly. Science won't be enough. If the snow thread is as old as Inuk legend claims, then the bond must be witnessed by more than us. That night, a stone circle was formed in the forest's heart. Snow fell like feathers as Ava, frail but conscious, was carried beside Kale, whose breaths had grown shallow. On her wrist, the snow mark glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Tulak sprinkled sacred herbs into the fire. Snowborn child, he intoned. Bind your soul to the lost one breath, one blood. Kale gave a low growl, not in pain, but in answer. Ava, for the first time, stood on her own. She staggered forward and placed her hand gently on Kale's forehead, and whispered, We're not done. By sunrise, the operating rooms were prepped for something never before attempted. A cross-species bone marrow transplant. The procedure was delicate, dangerous, and entirely experimental. Stem cells from Kale's marrow, filtered and purified, were transfused into Ava. Simultaneously, a fraction of Ava's marrow, containing the snow thread, was introduced to Kale's system. Naomi waited beyond the glass, hand clutching Ava's scarf. Tulak offered silent prayers, and even Emmerich, the lifelong skeptic, stood with head bowed. 3 days passed. No change. Then, on the 4th morning, Ava opened her eyes. She turned immediately toward the glass, her gaze clear, unnervingly calm. Kale, she whispered. In the adjacent chamber, Cale lifted his head and growled softly. A month later, both were relocated to a remote recovery center. Ava now spoke more, though still only to Cale. She was stronger, healthier, with color back in her cheeks. Cale too was reborn, his coat brighter, eyes once again gleaming with that wild ancient light. In her journal, Naomi wrote, "Perhaps the question was never how far apart our species are. Perhaps it's how many miracles we've forgotten, simply because we stopped believing in connection." And Ava, the child who once never spoke, became a symbol of something far beyond language. Cale lay by her side, tail thudding softly in agreement, the wild echo of a bond not just seen, but remembered. Those who were never meant to know, the sacred fire from that night still burned in Naomi's mind, even a week later. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of Ava lying motionless beside Cale under the moonlight would return, smoke spiraling like a dream river, binding two worlds, and Tulak's whisper in ancient Inuktitut, "Two souls, one blood." If they cross the boundary, they become the bridge. The transplant had worked, at least medically. Ava's bone marrow counts were rising, and Cale had started eating again. His eyes, once clouded like winter fog, were clearing, but Professor Ryland, head of the genetic research team, couldn't shake a sense of unease. "We have a problem," he told Naomi in a hushed voice, standing beside the heater in the research tent. "I've been tracking gene activity. It's not just healing, it's accelerating." Naomi narrowed her eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean, the genome isn't just repairing. It's rewriting." He placed a holographic display on the desk, showing Ava and Cale's DNA sequences. The red strands, labeled bridges, were glowing, intertwining like a neural web. "Like," Ryland hesitated, then met her eyes. "A synchronization." Naomi's breath caught. "Are you saying Ava and Cale are merging biologically?" "Biologically." "Not just biologically," his voice lowered. "I believe they're beginning to share memory." Elsewhere, in a small wooden room at the edge of the research compound, Ava lay wide awake. Cale curled on the floor beside her, motionless but alert. Though his eyes were closed, his mind was alive, buzzing with unfamiliar images. For Ava, everything felt louder: the cracks of ice on the distant river, the soft hooves of caribou across the trees, and images blurred like burnt film, but real. A woman's scream, cold gunfire, a mother's eyes, Cale's memories. And Cale was seeing hers too. Hospital rooms, 5E drips, loneliness, silence. They weren't just bonded anymore. They were beginning to become one. Thousands of miles away in Ottawa, inside an unmarked government facility beneath the Ministry of Defense, a new report landed on a heavy desk. Bridge ice activity reactivated. Hartley Moore, former commander of Project Argent 7, looked up from his worn file. Though the project had been shut down in 1991, he'd never truly been removed from power. "Deploy satellite scans," he ordered. "Sweep Coldridge. Look for any child carrying BN3A markers. And," he paused, "match it to Arctic Wolf Hybrid Code 1986K. 97% match confirmed," said the analyst. Moore's lips curved. They were never meant to survive, especially once they start talking to each other. The next morning, Naomi was handed a federal notice. The research facility would be temporarily shut down under a biosafety directive. "Not now," Ryland muttered. "We're on the edge of something no one's ever touched." Naomi's instinct screamed. This wasn't a health inspection. It was a containment op. At that very moment, Ava stood in the snowy backyard of the compound, Cale at her side. She placed a hand on his thick black fur and whispered, "It's time." Cale turned, golden eyes gleaming. Together, they vanished into the trees. When Naomi discovered they were gone, panic surged through her veins. "They couldn't have gone far," Ryland offered. "Cale still recovering?" "No," Naomi whispered. "They don't need roads. They feel each other. They feel each other. They feel them." Far to the north, unmarked trucks crested a frozen ridge. Men in white tactical gear stepped out, bearing the old insignia of Argent 7. a silver eye wrapped in birch leaves. "We need the subjects alive," the leader said. "But if they can't be retrieved, terminate." Deep in the Yukon forest, Ava and Kale reached a frozen lake. Ava knelt at the edge, breath fogging in the cold. Kale rested his head on her lap. "We have to go further," she whispered. "To where?" Tulak said. Amarok Nunak. Kale's ears perked. That name, the land of eternal ice, was whispered only in the oldest Inuk stories. But it was the only place left. By the time Naomi and Ryland found their trail, snow had begun to fall heavy. They followed prints into the woods until they stopped. Suddenly, inexplicably, hanging from a pine branch was Ava's hand-woven bracelet. In the snow, side by side, two tracks ran forward, a child's and a wolf's, and then vanished. Not faded, vanished. They had crossed somewhere else. As the final days of winter yielded to the gentle embrace of spring in Yukon, melting snowflakes descended like whispers of bygone memories. Ava Sinclair, now 13, stood silently before a modest stone marker at the entrance of the Deep Forest Connection Center. Etched into the stone were the words, "Kale, the unspoken companion, a soul forever near." Kale had passed away the previous year, on a serene, snowy night, with Ava by his side, her hand clasping his massive forepaw. His departure was not marked by tragedy, but by a peaceful return to the wilderness, to the place he had always belonged. That night, Ava did not shed tears. She didn't need to. Between her and Kale, death was not an end, but a mere divergence in a connection that transcended words and time. Nevertheless, those around them couldn't help but grieve. Kale was more than a wolf. He was a living symbol, a testament to healing beyond the realms of science. A.T. Dodian Cambridge Ikar, Kale's offspring, had since grown into a majestic creature. He bore his father's formidable stature, but possessed eyes of smoky gray rather than amber. Most remarkably, Ikar exhibited an innate ability to connect with children, who had long been enveloped in isolation. Whenever Ikar entered the therapy room, children with severe autism, previously unreachable, would extend their hands to touch his thick fur. And in those moments miracles unfolded. Ava now served as a senior guide within the program. Once a silent child herself, she had become a beacon for younger generations, not through words, but through her unwavering presence. She spoke little, but when she placed a reassuring hand on the shoulder of a trembling child, facing the imposing figure of Ikar, a bridge was formed. One day, while leading a group of students visiting from Toronto, Ava noticed a young boy named Min, a recent immigrant from Vietnam, halt abruptly at the threshold of the sanctuary. He stood frozen, wide-eyed with tears brimming, his small frame quivering uncontrollably. Ava didn't press him with questions. Instead, she signaled for Ikar to approach. Ikar advanced slowly, maintaining a respectful distance before sitting down, lowering his head and emitting a gentle whine, the same soothing sound that had lulled Ava to sleep during stormy childhood nights. Min lifted his gaze, and for the first time, tentatively reached out to touch Ikar's moist nose. The observation room fell into a hushed reverence. Min's mother, standing behind, broke into silent sobs. "He's never touched anyone like that before," she whispered. That evening, under a canopy of stars, Ava sat alone. Beside her, Ikar lay still, a steadfast shadow. She opened her journal, a sacred space reserved for dialogues with Kale. Her handwriting, though still bearing the traces of youthful uncertainty, conveyed profound depth. "Today I met a fragment of myself, a soul searching for its path, much like I once did. And Kale, I understand now, we never truly lose one another. For connections forged in the depths of the soul are impervious to the erosions of time." In the distance, snow began to fall once more, light as the breath of an old friend. And within the crisp night air, Ava heard a familiar howl, emanating not from Ikar's throat but from somewhere farther, deep within the forest, or perhaps deep within her heart. She smiled softly and whispered, "Hello again, Kale." The emotional story of Ava and Kale, a young autistic girl and a wild creature of ancient lineage, offers a profound lesson in healing, connection, and the value of being different. Ava didn't speak, didn't interact, and was often misunderstood by the outside world. Yet, within her silence beat a rhythm only a creature like Kale could hear. In a society where differences are still often met with suspicion or fear, This story reminds us that sometimes it is our differences that lead to miracles. Ava and Kale came from two seemingly incompatible worlds, human and wolf, but their connection transcended language and species, ultimately saving both of their lives. This reflects a real, universal need in our own lives, the desire to be understood, not through elaborate words, but through deep, genuine empathy. Science plays a vital role in the story, from DNA analysis to a groundbreaking stem cell transplant. But it is inseparable from cultural, spiritual, and emotional elements. In today's technology-driven world, where numbers and machines often dominate our trust, this story reminds us that some truths can only be grasped by the heart. The ancestral traditions, sacred rituals, and quiet beliefs became bridges between science and soul, between survival and hope. The story also invites us to reconsider our relationship with nature. Kale wasn't just a wolf. He was a symbol of the wild world we've caged, labeled as dangerous, and tried to tame. Yet when Ava placed her hand on that cage, she didn't see a threat. She saw a wounded soul, much like her own. That's a perspective our modern world sorely lacks, a sense of compassion not only for wildlife but for one another as human beings. From Ava and Kale, we learn that healing, whether for ourselves, others, or the planet, does not require sameness. It only asks that we be brave enough to listen, sensitive enough to feel, and persistent enough to love, even when no words are spoken. And sometimes, the miracle arrives in the smallest, most unexpected forms. A glance, a touch, a bond no one believed could exist. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.